In the freezing winter of late 1950, the world stood closer to a third global war than most people ever realized, and at the center of that terrifying possibility stood two men whose clash of wills would define the fate of millions. General Douglas MacArthur, one of the most decorated and celebrated military commanders in American history, was openly pushing for the use of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula and beyond. President Harry Truman, a former artillery captain from Missouri who had already authorized the only wartime nuclear strikes in history at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, flatly refused. What happened between these two towering figures was not merely a military disagreement, it was a constitutional crisis, a collision of ego and doctrine, and one of the most consequential power struggles in modern history. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of civilian control over the military, and possibly the survival of civilization itself. Most people know the Korean War as the Forgotten War, but what they don't know is how close it came to becoming something far, far worse. If this story already has your attention, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who loves real history, because the full story is even more extraordinary than you can imagine. Leave a comment below telling us what you already knew about this conflict, or what surprised you in just that first paragraph, because this community grows stronger every time real history reaches new eyes and ears. The roots of this confrontation stretch back long before the first shots were fired on the Korean Peninsula on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in a surprise invasion that shattered the fragile post-World War II order in East Asia. Douglas MacArthur was, by that point, already a legend, perhaps the most powerful American military figure of his era. Born in 1880 in Little Rock, Arkansas, he had graduated first in his class from West Point in 1903, served with extraordinary distinction in World War I, commanded Allied forces in the Pacific during World War II, and presided over the formal surrender of Japan aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. By 1950, he was serving as Supreme Commander of Allied powers in Japan, essentially governing an entire nation with near-absolute authority. His ego had grown to match his resume. He had not set foot in the continental United States since 1937. He surrounded himself with sycophants, rarely tolerated contradiction, and had developed what many in Washington privately described as a dangerous sense of personal infallibility. When the Korean War began, Truman appointed him commander of the United Nations forces, a decision that would soon prove to be one of the most explosive choices of his presidency. The early months of the Korean War seemed to validate every bit of MacArthur's legendary confidence. After a disastrous initial period in which North Korean forces pushed UN and South Korean troops almost entirely off the peninsula, MacArthur conceived and executed one of the most audacious military operations in American history. On September 15, 1950, he launched the Incheon landing, an amphibious assault against a port that military experts considered nearly impossible to attack due to its extreme tidal shifts of up to 30 feet and its heavily fortified approaches. The operation was a stunning success. Within weeks, UN forces had recaptured Seoul, shattered the North Korean supply lines, and sent the invading army into full retreat. MacArthur was triumphant, celebrated, and more convinced than ever that his judgment was beyond question. UN forces crossed the 38th parallel in early October 1950 and pushed deep into North Korean territory, advancing toward the Yalu River, the border with the People's Republic of China. Washington grew nervous. Intelligence warnings were accumulating. China had been sending clear diplomatic signals through India and other intermediaries that it would not tolerate UN forces approaching its border. MacArthur dismissed those warnings contemptuously, telling Truman at their Wake Island meeting on October 15, 1950, that the chance of Chinese intervention was minimal, and that if China did enter the war, their forces would be massacred. He was catastrophically wrong. In late October 1950, Chinese forces began crossing the Yalu River in massive numbers. Ultimately, nearly 300,000 soldiers under the command of General Pang De-hwai poured into North Korea in one of the largest and most secretive military operations of the 20th century. They moved at night, hid during the day, maintained strict radio silence, and struck with devastating effect. On November 25, 1950, the Chinese launched their main offensive, crashing into overextended UN lines with overwhelming force. The result was one of the worst military reversals in American history. The 8th Army collapsed along the Western Front. In the east, the 1st Marine Division and elements of the Army's 7th Infantry Division were surrounded at the chosen reservoir in brutal conditions, with temperatures plunging to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. More than 15,000 American and Allied soldiers were encircled. The Frozen Chosen campaign became one of the most harrowing fighting retreats in military history, ultimately successful but extraordinarily costly. MacArthur's grand prediction of a war over by Christmas had transformed into a catastrophe. And in that catastrophe, his thinking took a dark and dangerous turn that would shock even many of his own supporters in Washington. MacArthur's response to the Chinese intervention was not humility, it was escalation. He began publicly demanding authority to expand the war dramatically, in ways that ran directly counter to Truman's policy of limiting the conflict to the Korean Peninsula in order to avoid triggering a broader war with China or the Soviet Union. MacArthur wanted to bomb Chinese supply bases and industrial centers in Manchuria, north of the Yalu River. He wanted to use nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan, commanded by Chiang Kai-shek, to open a second front against mainland China. And most alarmingly, he began advocating for the use of nuclear weapons. In December 1950, MacArthur formally requested that the Joint Chiefs of Staff grant him discretionary authority to use atomic bombs as he saw fit, without waiting for presidential authorization. He envisioned dropping between 26 and 30 nuclear bombs across Manchuria and the northern Korean Peninsula, targeting Chinese troop concentrations, airfields, and supply routes. He spoke of creating a belt of radioactive cobalt along the Yalu River that would remain impassable for decades. These were not casual remarks, they were formal military proposals from the Supreme Commander of UN forces, and they landed in Washington like thunderclaps. Truman's refusal was absolute, immediate, and rooted in multiple layers of strategic, moral, and constitutional reasoning that the president articulated with remarkable clarity for a man often dismissed by his critics as an accidental president without the intellectual stature for the office. Harry Truman had authorized the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, decisions that haunted him deeply and that he defended publicly while privately carrying their weight throughout his remaining years. He understood, with a directness that MacArthur appeared to entirely lack, that nuclear weapons were not simply larger conventional bombs. They were weapons of mass civilization destruction, and using them in Korea would almost certainly draw the Soviet Union, which had successfully tested its own atomic bomb in August 1949, into the conflict. The Soviet Union and China had signed a mutual defense treaty in February 1950. A nuclear attack on Chinese territory could trigger a Soviet nuclear response against American targets. Truman was looking at a potential chain of events that began with bombs on the Yalu River and ended with bombs on New York, Chicago, and Washington. MacArthur, operating from his headquarters in Tokyo, seemed either unable or unwilling to think in those terms. Now, at the exact midpoint of this extraordinary story, we want to pause and ask you directly. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do it right now, and make sure to like this video, because stories this important deserve to reach as many people as possible. Share it with a friend, a history teacher, a student, or anyone who wants to understand how close the world came to a nuclear catastrophe in the early 1950s. And drop a comment below. Tell us what you find most remarkable so far, because your perspective matters and every comment helps this story reach someone who needs to hear it. The tension between Truman and MacArthur was not only strategic, it was deeply constitutional, touching the very foundation of American democracy. The principle of civilian control over the military, enshrined in the Constitution through Article 2, which designates the President as Commander-in-Chief, was being openly challenged by a five-star general who had come to believe that his military expertise entitled him to override presidential policy. MacArthur began making his disagreements public. He sent a letter to House Republican Minority Leader Joseph Martin in March 1951, which Martin read on the floor of the House of Representatives on April 5, 1951. In that letter, MacArthur explicitly criticized Truman's limited war strategy, arguing that there is no substitute for victory, a direct repudiation of the president's policy. He had also, in late March 1951, publicly issued his own unauthorized ultimatum to Chinese military commanders, essentially sabotaging a Truman administration peace initiative that had been carefully prepared through diplomatic channels. These were not the actions of a general who disagreed privately with his civilian superiors. These were the actions of a general who believed himself above civilian authority, and Washington's patience had reached its absolute breaking point. On April 11, 1951, Harry Truman did what many of his advisers had been urging him to do for months and what virtually none of them believed he would actually have the political courage to execute. He fired Douglas MacArthur. The announcement was made at 1 o'clock in the morning Washington time, an unusual hour that came about because the White House learned the story was about to be leaked to the press and wanted Truman's official statement to reach the public first. MacArthur learned of his dismissal not from a personal communication from the president, but from a staff aide who heard it on the radio, a humiliation that MacArthur never forgave. The public reaction in the United States was volcanic. MacArthur returned home to a hero's welcome. Ticker tape parades in San Francisco, Honolulu, and New York drew millions of people. He addressed a joint session of Congress on April 19, 1951, delivering his famous "Old Soldiers Never Die" speech that left grown men and women weeping in the galleries. Truman's approval rating plummeted. There were calls for impeachment. Senator Richard Nixon of California called the firing a usurpation of power. Senator Joseph McCarthy, already infamous for his anti-communist crusade, called Truman drunk. The political storm was unlike anything Washington had seen in decades. And yet, history has largely vindicated Truman. The Senate Armed Services Committee and Senate Foreign Relations Committee conducted joint hearings on the MacArthur dismissal throughout May and June of 1951, calling dozens of witnesses, including MacArthur himself and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What emerged from those hearings was a systematic dismantling of MacArthur's strategic vision by the very military leaders who had served alongside him. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, delivered what became perhaps the most quoted testimony in the history of American civil-military relations. Bradley told the senators that MacArthur's strategy would involve the United States in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. That single sentence captured what Truman had understood from the beginning, that Korea, terrible as it was not worth risking global nuclear war with both China and the Soviet Union simultaneously. MacArthur's nuclear proposals, stripped of their theatrical confidence, were revealed as dangerously reckless fantasies that could have ended not merely the Korean conflict but the post-war international order itself. The Korean War eventually ended in an armistice signed on July 27, 1953, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, with the peninsula divided almost exactly where it had been when the fighting began, at the 38th parallel. More than 36,000 Americans died in the conflict, along with an estimated 3 million Korean civilians and soldiers on both sides, and approximately 180,000 Chinese soldiers. MacArthur lived until April 5, 1964, never fully accepting that his dismissal had been just or necessary, and never abandoning the belief that a decisive nuclear blow could have ended the war on his terms. Truman lived until December 26, 1972, and to his final years remained absolutely certain that the most important decision of his presidency was not the atomic bombs dropped on Japan, but the firing of Douglas MacArthur, the moment when civilian authority over the military was preserved not by law alone, but by one man's willingness to absorb enormous political pain rather than surrender a principle on which constitutional democracy itself depends. The forgotten war deserves to be remembered, not only for its battles and its sacrifices, but for this hidden constitutional crisis at its heart, a crisis that almost gave one general the authority to start a nuclear war and was stopped by one president who understood that some powers must never be delegated, no matter the cost. If this story moved you, educated you, or changed the way you see this pivotal chapter of history, then please subscribe to this channel right now. Your support directly makes more stories like this one possible. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who you think deserves to know what really happened in Korea and Washington between 1950 and 1951, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most, what you didn't know before, or which figure in this story you find most compelling: MacArthur's dangerous confidence, Truman's quiet courage, or the world that almost was. Real history is not just the past, it is a mirror, and what we see in it should never be forgotten.